Hello there. Today we are going to discuss an event that occurred after World War II. You may be wondering, what am I talking about? It's about a hostile conflict that many people dread that it would be another war again, and this conflict is called the Cold War.
Enough of the music. Let's get this over with. Roll film.
In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and France and Britain declared war against Germany. Many other countries joined the war. They picked sides, and this became an international event with thousands of human lives lost. On August 6, 1945, the USA dropped 2 atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. After the destruction from the atomic bombs, the Japanese surrendered and the Second World War is over. Soon after World War II was over, the conditions that brewed the Cold War generated. A military race started between USA and the Soviet Union to determine who had more power. Capitalism against communism. Because of the Cold War, many people feared that a nuclear Third World War is possible. On this military race, human lives were being lost. What prevented the Cold War from becoming a hot war is that both sides stocked up on nuclear weapons. The USA and the Soviet Union did not want to resort to open war, which results in mass destruction. The Berlin blockade happened when the Soviet Union cut off transportation, railway, and canals to force the Allies to allow Soviet Union to take control over Berlin. In response to the Berlin blockade, the Western Allies organized airlifts to Berlin to provide food and supplies. The Soviet Union lifted the blockade in 1949 when they found the success of the airlift an embarrassment. The end of the blockade divided Berlin into 2 sides, and the Berlin Wall is constructed. The Suez Crisis started when in 1956, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser took control of the Suez Canal and threatens to prohibit ships going to and from Israel. In response, Britain, France, and Israel planned Operation Musketeer in order to regain control of the canal, while the Soviet Union aided Egypt. The USA was angry with France, Britain and Israel for not consulting with the US government before attacking Egypt. Canadian public opinion was strongly divided about the Suez Crisis. The Conservatives believed it was their duties to support Britain. Liberal Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent strongly denounced the French and British intervention. Lester Pearson went to the United Nations to try to work out a solution. He proposed multinational peacekeeping force to be created in order to maintain ceasefires and oversee the withdrawal of troops. The United Nations agreed and formed the United Nations Emergency Force. The UNF was sent to the Suez Canal area, to end hostility and bring a peaceful end. The UNF remained stationed at the Israel-Egypt border until 1967. In 1959, Cuban rebels led by Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's dictator, Fulgencio Batista. The USA responded angrily by placing economic sanctions against Cuba. In 1961, a group of Cuban exiles, aided by the USA, landed in Cuba, determined to overthrow the Castro government. The Bay of Pigs invasion failed, which encouraged Cuba to turn to the Soviet Union for support. The Cuban Missile Crisis began in October 1962 when USA observed that the Soviet Union is setting up offensive nuclear missile bases in Cuba. Americans considered this as a national security threat. U.S. President John F. Kennedy announced the naval and air blockade of Cuba. U.S. forces and NORAD are prepared for war. The premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, refused to dismantle the missiles. He put USSR forces on full alert, and sending USSR ships towards U.S. ships. At the last minute, Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missile bases, in exchange for U.S. promising not to invade Cuba. During the missile crisis, USA expects its NORAD partner Canada to provide unconditional support of its policies. John Diefenbaker, Prime Minister of Canada, preferred that the United Nations send a fact-finding mission to Cuba to verify the U.S. surveillance. Diefenbaker was reluctant to have Canada drawn into a major conflict which largely rooted in U.S. policies and interests. At first, the Canadian government refused to have Canadian NORAD forces on alert or allowing U.S. planes with atomic bombs to land on Canadian bases. The Cuban Missile Crisis hurt Canada-U.S. relations. The Vietnam War started when USA sent economic aid and military advisors to South Vietnam, but they ended up sending troops to South Vietnam. Canadians were divided on the opinion about the Vietnam War. Some Canadians find communism as a threat to Western security, but as the war progresses, more Canadians turn against American policy. Until 1968, the opponents were university students, but opposition came from many Canadians. In 1965, when Prime Minister Pearson spoke up against a U.S. bombing campaign in North Vietnam, he was severely reprimanded by President Lyndon Johnson. In 1979 the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan after Hafizullah Amin was killed. The result of the invasion is that many Western countries boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow. After World War II, the country of Korea was divided into North and South Korea. North Korea is a communist state while South Korea is a capitalist state. The Korean War happened when North Korea invaded South Korea. Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent sent thousands of troops and 3 naval destroyers to Korea. Meanwhile, Lester Pearson, Minister of External Affairs, urged both sides to agree on ceasefire. At some point, USA wanted to drop the atomic bomb on Korea, while General MacArthur wants to invade China. Sandwiched between World War II and the Vietnam War, the Korean War is known as Canada's Forgotten War. In 1989 the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the closing years of the Cold War. By the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union, realized that the Soviet Union could hardly afford its costly arms race with the USA. He announced massive cuts in the arsenal of both superpowers. Gorbachev began sweeping economic, social, and political reforms that will help communist governments operate more efficiently, and improves conditions for their citizens. He loosened censorship and allowed freedom of speech. These policies are known as perestroika and glasnost. These policies led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the Cold War is over.